Before I introduce tonight's important speaker, I want to acknowledge that there has been a lot of outrage this week. I have received all of your messages and I hear you. Yes, the president's referring to the January 6th hostages after having actual Israeli hostages on stage was an outrageous comparison. Even as we are grateful for whomever and however we get the hostages home, that kind of use of their trauma is unacceptable. Then there was Musk's Nazi salute debacle, which went along with the president's pardons of many neo-Nazi violent rioters. Even if Jonathan Greenblatt was right, and it was originally an awkward gesture, it should then have been followed up by a disavowal of fascism and neo-Nazism. Instead, Musk clarified things by making Nazi jokes. We know now exactly where he stands. These messages will embolden violence against our community and our kids at school. We as a congregation must always stand against anti-Semitism from the left and right, which this week includes white supremacy and signaling to the Proud Boys and Oath Keepers, of which there is unfortunately a long, well-documented history. It is not acceptable to talk out of both sides of your mouth when it comes to hatred of Jews. No one can morally support the Jewish people and neo-Nazis at the same time, depending upon what is politically self-serving or what you think is funny. But here's some additional points that I want to make going forward. First, I'm also worried about our trans congregants' well-being, how they will be bullied, and other pressing life and death issues. Second, we shouldn't demonize each other when we disagree, so please pause and investigate clickbait further. And third, Friday night services cannot be a reaction to the headlines of the week. Shabbat is not the daily news and review, and I am not Jon Stewart. And the Torah portion, the holidays and the celebrations and comfort needed by our congregation matter. In addition, more distant issues like what is happening in the Jewish community in Ukraine, which we're discussing tonight, are also very important. And this is the takeaway. Please save your strength for the places where you can make a difference. Act locally on your values. Be disciplined. And yes, there will be places to get things done together with all kinds of people of goodwill, but don't add to the sensationalism, distractions, and your stomach ulcers. Protect your mental health, and please, 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 guard your soul. Shabbat Shalom. So it's my honor to welcome Debbie Kardon to Temple Sinai. We're delighted that you're here. Want to say that Debbie comes to us through Marlene Bond and David Bone, and Marlene couldn't be here, but David is here representing, and what a team they are in helping out and collecting and distributing goods, and they've really led our congregation in its effort to connect with the community in Ukraine. So Debbie is the Executive Director of Action for Post-Soviet Jewry. She holds degrees from both Syracuse University and Hebrew Union College in social work and Jewish education. Debbie's journey in the Jewish community began during her college years when she started teaching part-time at a local congregation. Me too. Following her graduation, Debbie dedicated many years of her career to working with homeless and at-risk teenagers. Throughout this time, she maintained a part-time involvement in the Jewish community, showing her commitment to both causes. After a period focusing on raising her 3 children, Debbie returned to the workforce, taking on leadership roles within Jewish nonprofit organizations. Debbie's reputation as a change agent and organizational leader is well established. She has been instrumental in establishing innovative programs, securing funding, and leading the design and implementation of these initiatives. Her passion for Israel, yoga, teaching about the Holocaust, and spending quality time with her now adult children are integral aspects of her life. So please join me in welcoming Debbie to the Bima. after Debbie speaks, there will be time for some questions and answers.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you, David and Marlene. And thank you all for being here. And really, thank you for,
I'm just going to
okay. Thank you to your whole congregation. This temple has been an incredible support to our organization, and I really can't thank you enough. In fact, I'm kind of going off topic for a half a minute, if you'll oblige me. I sent the rabbi an email just the other day. I was doing some research in our organization's archives, and I came across a memo from 1993. Let me back up for a second. Our organization really had sort of three sections of work that we did. Our organization started in 1974, and we did a lot. Our organization was called at that time Action for Soviet Jewry, and we exclusively worked in the refusnik world. We did a lot of political advocacy, and we worked to free Jews from the Soviet Union. Very simple. Not very simple, but very simple, a very simple and targeted focus. When that was actually a very successful movement and a very successful grassroots movement, the organization had to decide what they were going to do next. And they joined together with a bunch of Boston organizations and connected to an unknown little community in Ukraine called, at that time it was called Dnepropetrovsk. There was a sparkling new rabbi and his very young wife who landed there to rebuild Jewish life and lives. And the Boston community agreed to be a partner with this little tiny community. The synagogue had been destroyed. There was really nothing there. There was no infrastructure. All of the infrastructure in Ukraine was pretty broken at that point. And so our Boston community agreed to be a partner city with what we now know as Dnepro. And in this memo from 1993, Temple Sinai was connected to this community with their medical committee. So there was a medical committee that was set up in Dnepro, and Temple Sinai was the sole liaison to that committee. And I want to tell you how impressive this is. I want to try to explain how impressive this is. Now, again, remember, there's no infrastructure. There's really not a lot going on there. There's this medical committee that gets set up. And from this small medical committee, somehow the Boston community manages to build what is called the Jewish Medical Center, which at the time was a very small kind of medical clinic. Doctors from Boston went to Dnepro to train doctors there because the medical training there was atrocious. Doctors from there came to Boston and got trained here in Boston. And this Jewish Medical Center has now grown to this state-of-the-art, amazing facility that does surgery, that just recently built a rehab center. If you know anything about medical care in Ukraine, there is no such thing as rehabilitation in Ukraine. So this is like the Jetsons in Ukraine to have a rehabilitation center. And our organization just partnered with the Jewish Medical Center last year to start an innovative telehealth program for our elders who live outside of the Dnepro area. And I know you and I are used to telehealth. We've gotten very used to it. But think about an elderly person living alone in what we would consider a shtetl, a small little village. They don't have computers. They don't have iPhones. They don't have iPads. They have a landline or a basic flip phone. And somehow they're connecting with a doctor in Dnepro. There's no health insurance. Everything has to get paid for up front. And this telehealth thing kind of is working, and they're getting amazing health care. So what started in 1993 as this, connection between Temple Sinai and this medical committee in Dnipro somehow got built upon and transformed into something that is saving lives in the middle of a war today. And that is pretty amazing. When you talk about this idea of starting something because you can't turn away from it and you don't know how it's going to materialize over the years, that just seemed to me to be such a great example, and such a great example of a little bit of hope. You just don't know when you put one foot in front of the other and you start something, how that's going to play out. And I just thought that being here at Temple Sinai and sharing that story was just a beautiful way of expressing that. The other thing I wanted to say is I just got such an incredibly warm welcome when I walked in here tonight, and I wanted to thank everybody for that. I come in and out of a lot of temples in my life. I've worked in and out of a lot of temples, and the welcome I got here tonight was just absolutely heartwarming. And it's especially nice to be in this temple with people that I love and I know dearly, and that is also just a pleasure to be here tonight. So I wanted to share a little bit about what's happening in Ukraine and what life is like for our organization and for the people that we work with in Ukraine. It's now believe it or not, it's now day 1,056 of the war. 56 or 65, something like that. It's 2 years and 11 months. Next month will be 3 years of war. We never imagined any of that. When the war first broke out, everybody was saying, oh, it'll be a few days. And then it was like, oh, it'll just be a few weeks. And then by September, it'll be over. And then September turned into November, and then the year came up, and then a second year, and now we are into a third year. And it is hard. It is really, really hard. Our organization mostly works with elders, and we mostly work with people who fall into what we call the aid gap. So they're not really eligible for aid from other organizations, or they're not getting adequate aid for other organizations. So we often consider ourselves sort of the food pantry to the welfare system. So for people who can't quite make it through the month, we help out. We work in, I say about 15 communities, because 3 of our communities are under Russian control. 1 we're not allowed to work in anymore, and 2 have been so devastated that the people we do work with have either have left those communities and are internally displaced within Ukraine, or they have left Ukraine completely. Those communities are Melitopol and Mariupol, which I'm sure you've heard about in the news. So when the war first broke out, people were very resolute and very strong and very sure that that they weren't going to need a lot of help, that this was going to be okay. And as the war has dragged on, it has gotten more and more and more difficult. And because we work with this particular population of mostly elders who mostly live in smaller villages and who mostly live by themselves, it has been very traumatic for them. Many of them lived through the very ends of World War II or were born just after World War II. So they have some memory of what that was like in the rebuild of that time. And this whole war brings back a lot of memories for them. But on a day-to-day basis, what this means is, especially now, especially what's happening today, is Russia has kicked up their attacks on Ukraine. So there are lots of missile attacks, there's lots of drone attacks, there's lots of air raids that go off every day, constantly. And many of our elders can't make it to bomb shelters, they can't make it, they don't have adequate emergency things in their basements. They have places in their apartments, like in doorways that they stand in. But what is really difficult for them are the blackouts. So Russia, as you know, has been targeting the infrastructure. They target the electrical system, they target the water systems, they target the cell phone systems, they target all of those kinds of systems. And at the beginning of the war, it was easier for Ukraine to quickly get these systems back up in place. As the war has dragged on, it's harder and harder, it takes longer and longer. And at the beginning of the war, the government used to shut down things for a particular amount of time so that they could, on a rolling basis, so that it was predictable. And this winter, it's not predictable, it just goes off. And so what happens is, in some of our areas where we have elders who live in buildings that have elevators, if they go out, they risk not being able to then have the elevator to go back up. And it's cold, and then they're outside in the cold for a long period of time. So then you have people who just don't leave their apartments because it's just not safe for them to leave their apartments. So, and then you have people who just don't leave their apartments because with all of the air raids and the drones and the bombing, it's just unsafe for them to leave their apartments. And you have people who are living alone and feeling very isolated. And when we send aid, and Marlene and David have sent boxes, have organized people to provide these boxes and boxes of aid, oftentimes we send them with little notes. And before the war, we sent these little notes, and they were nice, and people liked them, and they got a little kick out of them. But now, in each of our communities, we have a care coordinator who sort of organizes all of the care for each of the elders. And what they say to us is, when we send these notes and our elders get them and they read them, they cry because they feel so connected to the fact that there is somebody out there that sees them and cares about them and wants to help them. And that is almost more important to them than the aid that they're getting at this point. And so the work that our organization does is on three pillars. We have a micro grant program where we work with about 200 of these elders, and we send a small stipend on a monthly or bi-monthly basis. And it's different than a lot of other programs because we don't really have a requirement for what they can spend this money on. They're empowered to choose what they need most, and they can spend the money on that. And usually it's either medicine or food or to pay a utilities bill. Inflation has gone up, I think something like 20 to 30%, and it just keeps going up in Ukraine. And most of our pensioners live on the equivalent of less than $100 a month. So you can see where they are living in drastic poverty. And the little bit of money that we send just takes the edge off a little bit and allows them to do something. And we've had elders say, I went to the pharmacy knowing that I had to buy five different prescriptions, and I knew I couldn't afford all of them. And as I was checking out, I got a notification from my care coordinator called me to say that the stipend had come through, and I was able to buy all the medicine. So those are the kinds of things that we're able to do. Not all the time, but when we do it and we do it right, it's quite miraculous. The other thing we do is the telehealth project, and that in itself has been unbelievable. Most of the elders that we serve were incredibly suspicious of medical care. They grew up during the Soviet times where Soviet medicine was not always honest or transparent or good, and they had a lot of disbelief in the work that we were doing, and we had to spend a lot of time convincing them to try this telehealth service. And they did, and after the first full year of it, we now have 100% of our elders enrolled and using this service. And we've been able to do things like help people who have needed some outpatient surgery. We've been able to do things like detect some stomach things and things that are fixable, things that you can actually fix that help people live a healthier life, which is really amazing. And then the last thing, the other thing with the telehealth project that we've been doing is trying to get some mental health and art therapy in. And again, if you know this population at all, you will know that any kind of therapy is just not even acknowledged. Any kind of mental health is not acknowledged as an issue. So the fact that they are willing to participate in the programs is just an incredible testament to the coordinators that we have and the relationships that they've built with people. And what they have said is that the times that they have participated in these things, they are so taken and so amazed that they can, for a few minutes, just clear their minds of the stress, of the sound of the air raids, just even for a few minutes, and how much of a relief that is. And so some of the things that we've been sending are art supplies and things that people can do in their own homes, even when we're not able to provide the sort of structured art therapy. And the final thing that we provide is this humanitarian aid. And that goes beyond even the elders that we work with. And we've sent it to different programs that we have partnerships with. We have a partnership with a Big Brother, Big Sister program in Dnipro. We have partnerships with a Mom to Mom program. We have a partnership with with I think one of the only senior resident programs, like residential programs, in the Dnipro area, and other programs like that. And we've sent, I think, I'm gonna point out Marlene and David again, but we got a call, I think not last summer, the summer before, that the Jewish day school was finally going back in person remember, the war started right after COVID, so the kids had not really been in school since COVID, and they had built an air raid shelter at the school, so the kids could actually go to school. And they really wanted the kids to get to school with new backpacks and new school supplies. Inflation had been so high that they called us and said, can you supply them with new backpacks and new schools and new school supplies? And Marlene and David somehow pulled it together to send, I think, something like 600 backpacks filled with brand new school supplies for the kids to welcome them back to school finally. So those are the kinds of things that the organization does. And I think that's what I wanted to say.
Debbie, thank you. I'm curious. I'm going to take, before I take any questions from the congregation, I've got questions. I've got questions.
And I want to say before you start the questions,
Please.
I'm an educator by training, and I think more information comes from questions than from talking. So I really welcome questions. So I really hope you all have lots of questions. And any question is a good question and will help think about like what we're doing.
So I have a few questions. First of all, when we go outside for Kiddush, there's a bunch of posters on easels that are out there. Can you tell us a little bit about what is that? What's that about?
Thank you for reminding me about that. So you'll see a couple of different things on those posters. One is some artwork. We had our translator, Galina, has a daughter, Nadia, who is in her 20s. And is an amazing graphic artist. And at the beginning of the war, we commissioned her to, I think weekly almost, do a reflection of her impression of the war. And we have a whole book of her art, and it's really amazing. So some of the pictures up there are reflections that she did for us around what it was like to be a 20-year-old during the beginning of the war. So that's some of that, and then some.
Let me jump in there for just a second, because 2 years ago, one of the ways that we acknowledged people's donations was we had Nadja do the Hebrew alphabet with Ukrainian folktale characters. And so those were posters that were made available to people. Some of you may have gotten those as a thank you for your donation. And that's framed as well in our religious school wing. So that's there. Also, when you mentioned Jewish Medical Center, this was like now 2 years ago, Marlene and David also fundraised, and we got an electric generator that got delivered to the medical center that arrived apparently like a day before a blackout, and they were able to plug it in and do surgeries on that with that power source. But tell us what else is out there, please.
So, and then there's a number of pictures of some of the elders that we serve, some of them with some of the things that we've sent them. And a few of them are with their care coordinators as well. And I just think they're just beautiful pictures, and it just shows who they are and what they are. Like the two pictures that are just next to where you have the Kiddush table set up, there's a man and a woman, and their story, I'm just going to quickly tell you their stories. The man, I actually met my last trip to Ukraine, and he's quite special. He had a number of this is how bad the medical situation is, and he is why we started the telehealth project. In his 30s, he had a series of strokes, and his whole left side was paralyzed. And he's in a wheelchair, and he basically cannot leave his apartment because nothing in Ukraine is handicapped accessible. And so even though he's on the first floor, there's like a whole flight of steps to get up to his apartment. And even just to get out of his apartment, the threshold is high. So it's hard for his wheelchair to even get out of that apartment. So he was really trapped in his apartment. This was even before the war, before COVID. And I asked him how he got medical help, and he said it was really hard, and sometimes he just had to call the doctor, and he would talk to the doctor on the phone. And I thought, he really needs telehealth. Like, we need to get a telehealth project going. So from 2019 to 2024, it took to get this telehealth project going, but he was the one that inspired me to do that. And when I met him, he was probably he had the strokes in his 30s, he was probably like in his 60s. And he was paralyzed and in this wheelchair because he never had rehab. They do not have rehab. They had no system for rehab. They didn't have PT. They didn't have anything like that. I know that's really hard to believe, but they didn't have even a training program to train physical therapists. So this is why these kinds of programs that we're doing is so important.
I'm going to ask two more questions, and then I'm going to turn to the congregation, but burning questions. Next question, what's it like for you to travel to Ukraine?
So I haven't traveled to Ukraine since 2019. We've started to think about traveling at the beginning of the war. We weren't going to travel during COVID because the healthcare was so bad and there were so many restrictions, and the worry was that if you got COVID, we wouldn't be able to ever leave Ukraine. And then the war broke out, and we've thought about going as far as Lviv, and every time we started to plan, things would get really hot, and we decided not to. So we're kind of waiting for things to come down a little bit.
But shipments somehow get in.
Shipments get in. And this is, I love telling people how shipments get in.
Please.
So they start in our office, we pack them up, we drive them to our shipping place, which is now, I think, is it in Norwell? Is that Norwell? We leave it there. It's like a self drop-off place, and miraculously, we just leave it there. And then it goes on a truck to New Jersey. And from New Jersey, it either goes on a plane or a ship, depending on how fast we want it to get to Ukraine. And then you can't get anything directly into Ukraine because all of the airports in Ukraine have been demolished. So they send it to, I think, Poland. And then from Poland, it gets trucked over the border to Ukraine into one of their distribution centers. Now, somewhere in that line, it has to go through customs. Customs in Ukraine can be a little tricky, and sometimes things get stuck in customs. And a few times we've had customs call us and say, we need money for it to go from A to B. And sometimes we'll say, no, just send it back to us. And then miraculously, it just shows up wherever it's supposed to show up. So it's always an interesting journey for our stuff to get there, but somehow it always seems to get to where it needs to go. The beginning of the war, it was a little more difficult because...
More difficult than what you just described.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, because people weren't driving through Ukraine at that time, and things, it would start to go someplace, and then they'd say, oh no, we're not shipping there anymore, and then we'd have to change the direction, and sometimes we had to hire somebody to go from Dnipro to Lviv to pick things up and bring it to Dnipro and then distribute it from Dnipro, but somehow we managed to get everything through.
So my last question, which is, there are so many headlines, there's so much desperation in the world. There's locally, we have an affordable housing crisis, we're watching the hostages in Israel, there's so many things that pull at our attention. Can you please speak to, and one of the fears, and I remember talking about this with Marlene and David, one of the fears was like, we can't let this just fade into the background. We can't let this be forgotten. The longer the war goes on, the more it'll just become yesterday's background news. Back when there were newspapers, actual physical newspapers, I think some of you still read physical newspapers, but it's now on the back pages. What motivates you to keep this front and center, and what should motivate people at Temple Sinai to give to this and make this a high priority? Answer it personally, if you could.
Okay, that is a great question. And it's a question that keeps me up at night because the Ukraine war has been sent to the back of the news. And I meet with Ella, who is our director in Ukraine, every Tuesday morning. And every Tuesday morning, I start off with, tell me what's going on because we're not getting the news here. And I meet with Ella and Galina, who is our translator. Ella is in Dnipro, and Galina is in Kiev. And as the war has progressed, especially lately, the news has been more and more that the war is getting closer and closer and closer to them. Oftentimes, Galina in Kiev is sitting in the dark she has two internet services so that she can switch between the two depending on the blackout situation. But oftentimes she's sitting in the dark and she's sitting with sweaters on because it's cold. And Ella was saying last week that the bombing that happened in Dnipro happened just 3 blocks from her house, that she could feel the windows shaking in her apartment. And one of our communities is next to one of the communities that Russia is really trying to conquer before there is this, quote, peace that might happen, because they're trying to get as much land as they can. And the coordinator said that everybody in their, I'm gonna like choke up a little bit, but everybody in their community, including our elders, have packed a ready bag because they just don't know where this land grab is gonna go. And if you think about boundaries, you know, Sharon is next to, what, Canton? Mm-hmm. You know that streets are not linear, right? So you don't know where this is gonna go. And every week, I live in a war zone. I open up my Zoom and I am there. And so for me, this is really personal. These are people that I've met, that I care about, and that are in my living room, my dining room actually, every single Tuesday morning. So it's incredibly personal to me. It's hard for me to say why the world should care about, or why any of you here should care about any one of these things more than another. I've written quite a bit about One Heart and Two Wars, where we have a lot of our elders who went to Israel, and I'm very connected personally to Israel on a number of levels. It's amazing to me the capacity that a human heart and a human soul has to care about all of the things that are going wrong in the world. And I know that we all have to prioritize where we spend our resources and where we give our time. But I know that caring for people in a small shtetl, unknown someplace, is a lot harder to pull your heartstrings for than some other causes that seem a little more like your investment will make a difference as the world as in the future. But I would say that just caring for people who need care is an important thing to do.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I want to open it up to the congregation. Leslie, I'm going to need to repeat all of the questions because people online won't be able to hear unless it's set into a microphone. So Leslie's question is, considering that things like textbooks, Ukrainian textbooks and things like that, there's not something that we can buy and put in a box and ship, and it'd probably be more effective to send checks. And many of these things were probably already destroyed in the war. What do you think is the most effective way to give and support, like schools and other institutions?
I think in many instances, I do think that financial support is the easiest way for a number of reasons. One is because then you can target it exactly where it needs to go. and sometimes we can buy things in bulk or in that way. Sometimes it's easier to buy things here and send it over because you can't find it there, or it's very expensive there. So Marlene and David just did a big medical supply. We wanted to create these medical kits for our elders, and they actually feel that the over-the-counter medicines that they can get from the U.S. are better and stronger and more powerful than what they can get in Ukraine. I'm not sure that that's true, but they feel it is, and so who am I to...
So there are some things that are cheaper and better to get here and ship, and there's other things where it's just better to send the money, and you can do that strategically.
Exactly.
Other questions?
And that's a great question. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to David, and then I'll go to Elaine. David? He's asking if you have any insight or commentary on the military situation that's coming up. The answer can be no.
So,
You're not a military
I'm
expert.
not a military expert. Every week we do talk about this, and I think the hardest part in this, one of the hardest things about this whole war, and one of the hardest things that's causing the most trauma is the uncertainty. And I think that the biggest concern with whatever is going to happen next in this military thing is the uncertainty. And I think that is the concern, is no one really understands what the strategy is or what is going to come next.
Elaine? How do you recruit caregivers?
That's an excellent question. So the caregivers that we have one for each community, and they're people who really know the Jewish communities that they live in, and they understand who is in need and the level of need that people have. A lot of it is relational. Our business is all about relationships. The relationship that I have with Ella, I hired Ella at the beginning of COVID when I wasn't able to travel, but I knew another executive director in Ukraine from my travels, and she connected me to Ella, and that's how I got to know Ella. And Ella got to know the coordinators by her relationships with people, and I've gotten to know the coordinators through our meetings over Zoom. And it's all about building relationships. And the only way we've been able to get our elders involved in the programs that they're involved in is the relationships that the coordinators have with the elders.
There's a story from the Talmud that says that Elijah, the prophet, who's apparently still alive and with us and visiting us on Passover, was hanging out, and Rabbi Yehuda comes up and says, "When's the Messiah supposed to come? You're supposed to announce the Messiah. When's the Messiah? Where is the Messiah hanging out anyway?" He says, "At the gates of Rome, among the sick and the poor." And so Rabbi Yehuda runs and checks it out and sees that the Messiah is there, and notices that the Messiah is changing bandages one by one of people, one by one. And I think that that's the best we almost can ever do, is we affect things person by person, one by one. We change one bandage at a time. You put the bandage in the box, and it goes one box at a time. And that's actually, those micro grants probably have a much greater impact in that economy than they would have here. So I want to thank you for your leadership and for bringing this to the front of our consciousness and to keep us current with what's happening. And I wish you and everyone here Shabbat Shalom. We're going to make Kiddush. We're going to make kiddush in the lobby, in the atrium, and you can see the posters. And then let Debbie go out there, please. Don't stop her here. We're all going to meet out there. We're going to make kiddush. We're going to make motzi, and then you can ask Debbie more personal one-on-one questions. Shabbat shalom, everyone, and thank you.